All right, the final prerequisite skill is to evaluate powers that have integer exponents. So exponents. First of all, when we're talking about notation, how we write things. So for instance, 3 and then 5. 3 is our base, and our 5 is our exponent, or power. So we say 3 to the exponent 5, or 3 to the power of 5, meaning the same thing. A few of the exponent rules, these are not all of them. This whole unit you'll be looking at exponent laws as time goes on. So a few of them just to remind you. So a to the 0. So any number to the 0 equals 1, except if you notice if a equals 0. All right, so we're not allowed to have a base of 0 in any of the exponent laws. All right, so any base other than 0 to the power of 0 always equals 1. Negative exponents. Now these ones too were a little bit of the ones that often confuse students because it doesn't make sense to you even though the teacher shows you over and over again why it does work. What happens when the base is going to stay positive? You can see it's positive. The problem that's negative has to do with the power, the exponent. The exponent here is negative n, so it could be any number. What that happens here is we take our base, in this case a, and we flip it. So we reciprocate it. So right now to reciprocate a, it's really a over 1, as every number is. And when we reciprocate it, it becomes 1 over a. And instead of a negative power, it becomes a positive power. So you can't just flip something. You have to flip and change the sign of the exponent. Notice that the base a is positive here. It's still positive here. So the negative power does not affect whether the base is positive or negative. All right, so our questions that we're going to look at, the first set of them, evaluate without using a calculator. And you're saying, "Oh, really? Well, obviously I'm not going to know whether you use your calculator or not, but I think most of these are pretty easy to be able to do. So if I have negative 5 to the power of 3, that is negative 5, and it needs to be multiplied by itself 3 times because that's what the power says. So I have three negative numbers, so I know my final answer will be negative. 5 times 5 is 25, times another 5, 125. Now, obviously, I wouldn't be able to tell whether you used your calculator here. But when you have a negative power, I can, because we don't want it as a decimal. All right, so in this case, I don't want it as a decimal. So first of all, negative 3. So that means I'm going to flip my base. Okay, so my base is now reciprocated. And instead of to the power of negative 3, it's to the positive 3. So that's the same as 1 over 2 times 2 times 2, which equals 8. Okay, so obviously if you took your calculator to calculate that, you're going to end up with a decimal. All right, this way I have a fraction, which is usually more exact. Now let's look at the last one in this set of questions. Again, I have a negative power, and what's going on with that negative power is I have a fraction already. So this time when I reciprocate the base, the 3 is going to become the numerator, and 4 becomes the denominator, and I still have a power, and the power that I have is positive 2. Now I can calculate this two different ways. I know that your textbook tells you to do 4/3 times 4/3, and that's true, okay? And so 4 times 4 is 16, and 3 times 3 is 9. You could actually do it a different way. And what you could do is when you get to this stage here, and I'm just going to write it beside so you can see that there's an alternative way, you could change that to 4 squared over 3 squared. So in fact, we're bringing the power into each one of these. And when we do that, we end up with obviously 4 squared is 16 and 3 squared is 9. You end up with the same answer. This is actually another exponent law, the quotient law, which allows us to bring it in to both the numerator and the denominator. All right, so let's look at the types of questions that we can use our calculator for. So just like some of the other prerequisite skills, they're asking us to round to the nearest hundredth. So literally what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my calculator and actually, I guess I don't have one quite handy, but I'll do that for some of the other ones in future lessons. So what I really do is I take my calculator and I know where my power button is, and then all I do is I punch in and out comes an answer, and this one turns out to be 42 decimal 94967. Now, obviously, that is more than to the nearest hundredth. Now, the reason I did that is so that we can see when we're rounding, because some of you um, don't take the time to round. You just write your 3 decimals or 2 decimals, and that's it. So this is tenths, this is hundredths. So the 4 is going to become a 5 because the 9 forces the 4 up. Okay, the next one. My base here is negative. So when you're using your calculator, make sure you put a bracket, then the negative 1.03, close your bracket to the power of 5. The reason being, not all calculators are created equal. And just to make sure that your calculator is using a negative base. And the way you can tell whether your calculator does that, if you calculate this and you end up with a positive number, it's wrong. Okay, so I have an odd power, negative base. I'm going to have a negative answer. So I have negative 1.1, and to the nearest hundredth is going to be 6. And finally, another question that's slightly different. Okay, in this case, we have 53 and then a bracket. So we have a couple of different things going on here. Order of operations still applies. So BEDMAS, so brackets, exponents. So it means I have to calculate the decimal 56 to the power of 3 first and then multiply it by 53. Now, most scientific calculators, if you actually type it in the way you see it here, you're usually fine. But I'm going to put the extra step in there just in case you do not have a fabulous calculator. And by the way, your phone calculators are not always the best choice. And again, I'm not rounding until closer to the end. And when I do that, 53 times this lovely little decimal, I end up with 9.307. So that's going to be 3, 1. Okay, a few questions for you to try and have fun.